come to grips with this and do the same. Mr. President, thank you. I yield the floor.
Thank you. Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Can I inquire of the chair what the status is on the bill, and are there pending amendments?
Currently, there are no amendments pending.
Thank you. I'd ask unanimous consent to call up Amendment 521.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, proposes an amendment numbered 521.
I'd ask unanimous consent that it be considered as read.
Without objection, the senator is recognized.
Mr. President, thank you for the recognition. About 3 months ago, one of the results of the last time we raised the debt limit was a report by the Government Accounting Office. 97 senators in this body voted to put that in the last debt limit extension. And what was that? That was a requirement for the Government Accounting Office over the next 3 years to list every program for us in every area so we knew what we were doing. And the purpose for that amendment, that happened to have been my amendment, was because when I went to the Congressional Research Service and I went to the Government Accounting Office, I said, I want to know every program in education, I want to know every program in defense, I want to know every program. And what they told me is it's impossible, we can't do it. We cannot give it to you. So we, and us collectively as colleagues, said, you will do this. And it's been a big job. They've done a fantastic job on it thus far, and I can't wait till we get the second third of that. But one of the results of that was the first report that the Government Accounting Office reported to us showed close to $200 billion worth of duplications. Now, that's not the CBO's number because they haven't scored it. That's my number in terms of looking at it. But, and let's say I'm twice wrong. Let's say it's $100 billion. But the fact is what we found in just the first third of looking at the federal government, that we have multiple sets of duplicative programs that do exactly the same thing. They're just in a different agency, or they're across agencies. And in a moment, I'll talk about what those are. But the response to that report was the greatest response that GAO has ever had to any report that they've ever listed. The curious thing about that is 95% of what they reported on was a culmination of reports I'd asked for over the last 6 years put together, which means we had the information as members of Congress, we just wouldn't use it. In other words, it didn't get up to the level of being recognized that here's this and here's this. Only when we saw it together did all of a sudden we start seeing the magnitude of the problem of duplication. The purpose of this amendment, and it's very straightforward, is that on average the Senate considers in a session of Congress, in a Congress over 2 years, about 700 pieces of legislation. The Congressional Research Service now writes a report on each one of those and advises us about the legislation, what it does, what it doesn't do, what is out there. But the one thing that they don't do is they don't tell us where it duplicates things. And so the purpose of this amendment is that with each of those bills, that we would have the knowledge that the GAO has put out there, that the CRS will then go and get and say, here's what's out there now. And you need to consider that as you consider, why do we need another program to do something that we're already doing? What is wrong with the programs that we have now that are not accomplishing it? What it'll do is create transparency, not just for us, but for the American people. Because we add duplicative programs every year. And what it really raises the question of is, where's the oversight to see when we go to solve a problem? And the motivations here are wonderful. The motivations are to try to solve problems. But too often we lack the information, the knowledge with which to make a great decision. And the reason we lack that is because we fail on our duty to do oversight. So this information that would be provided becomes powerful. But more importantly, it creates tremendous transparency for the American public in saying, for example, if we're going to create another job training program, we have 47 of them right now funded by the federal government across 9 different government agencies. None of them are coordinated, and all but 3 overlap each other. Well, if we create another job training program, maybe we ought to know what all these others are and why we need to create another one rather than to make the ones that we have now work. I would actually question why we have 49 job training programs. But the problem is big. And let me spend a moment to put into the record just some highlights, and these are just the highlights. It represents less than a 10% of what the findings were of the last GAO report. We have 101 programs for surface transportation. They're run across 4 different agencies. We have 82 teacher quality improvement programs, 82 separate programs across 10 different, they're not in the Department of Education. There's 10 different agencies, 9 of which are outside the Department of Education that have teacher training programs. We have 88 economic programs run by 4 agencies costing $6.5 billion a year, 88 separate economic development programs. We have 80 programs to provide transportation for the disadvantaged across 8 different agencies. We spend $314 million on them. That's a good cause. That's something that we can do. But 80 different programs? We don't know what we're doing. So the purpose of this amendment, and it'll require a rules change to have it, is to ask CRS to show what are we doing and what's there already, just like they analyze every other aspect of a bill before it comes to the floor. This won't be required on emergency legislation. It won't be required on committee reports. It won't be replied on filing of bills. It'll only be mandated if a bill comes to the floor for consideration by my colleagues. Let me finish up. We have 56 programs for financial literacy from 21 different agencies. Based on the talk we just heard of the last 2 senators, we're the last people that ought to be teaching anybody about financial literacy when we're running the kind of deficits and have the kind of debt we have and have the kind of duplication we have. Nobody who knows financial literacy would run 88 separate economic development programs and pay for the overhead of all of those through all these different agencies. Rather, they'd have 2 or 3, have a concentrated oversight and direct the emphasis of whatever that economic development program would be. We have 21 programs for homeless assistance. We spend $62 billion on 18 different food and nutrition assistance programs. We don't need 18. We need 2 or 3. And we need to have metrics on them to measure, are we effective in helping people with food and nutrition? We have bureaucracy after bureaucracy that's doing the same thing that another bureaucracy is doing in a different agency. And they don't know what the other agency is doing. And there's no coordination. And there's no measurement of the effectiveness of what we're doing. CRS claims that they don't have the manpower to do this. They have 350 analysts that do nothing but analyze legislation. This would require 1 analyst 1 time a year to look at the duplication on a bill coming to the floor. 1 analyst over a period of a year, 1 time, looking at it. CRS is a great resource to me. And I want them to have the resources that they need, because the only way we get out of the bigger problems that the senator from Nebraska was talking about is having the knowledge of what we're doing today. So my hope is that my colleagues will consider this not as a partisan amendment, not as trying to, but to give us information which gives us the power to make the best decisions for our country. And we need to be making better decisions. The other final thing this will do will help us not create a duplication again. It'll help us know what we need to do. And that's before we pass it into legislation. I'm so concerned as I look in bringing forward some options for my colleagues to look at in terms of solving our financial. Everywhere I go, as we dig deeper and deeper into this, we see the duplication, the inefficiency, the lack of direction, the lack of pointed purpose to get an end result in program after program after program of the federal government. Some of those truly aren't our role. But on those that are our role, that we are truly responsible for, constitutionally it is a responsibility of the U.S. Congress and the U.S. government, we ought to know what we're doing. And we ought to know what's being done out there already. And we operate in a vacuum when we don't have this information. So it's my hope that my colleagues will support this in a way to give us information. There's nothing political about it. It is how do we make better decisions and how do we do this in a way that will cause us not to create more duplication in the future, cause us to ask the smart questions about legislation. You see, those questions don't get asked unless somebody goes and does the digging now. And what my hope would be is we would all be empowered by having greater knowledge over what we're doing. It's very simple, it's very straightforward, and it would be my hope that we could accomplish that. And I would yield the floor and notice the absence of a quorum. Oh, I withdraw that.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I want to congratulate the Senator from Oklahoma on his remarks and his participation in this debate. I would say that before long we should have whenever the majority leader decides, we should have a vote on the Coburn Amendment. We're at a position on this rule that, or resolution, that relevance amendments are in order, but at the moment we don't have any others, and if we don't have others, why then we'll proceed to the final bill later this afternoon as the majority leader decides that we should do that. We passed the bill this morning with 79 votes, and I'll have more to say about this resolution in a moment. But I wanted to say something that is directly relevant to what the Senator from Oklahoma talked about. We keep talking about duplication, which is an important part of our oversight responsibility. But sometimes that leads to the elimination of government bureaucracies, which is a rare event. Ronald Reagan once said a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life that we'll ever see on this earth. And I had an example of that, I would say, to the Senator from Oklahoma this morning in a Rules Committee hearing. The purpose of the hearing was to review the qualifications of 3 excellent men and women who were nominated by the President to serve on the Election Assistance Commission. But what I said at the hearing and what I would like to say on the floor today, with all due respect to those excellent nominees, instead of considering the nominees, we should be abolishing the commission because it doesn't have anything to do. It's finished its work and it ought to be abolished. The Election Assistance Commission was commissioned in 2003. Since then, the Rules Committee didn't have one single oversight hearing on the commission. My predecessor in my position had asked for an oversight hearing. We didn't have one. I'd asked for one earlier this spring. We didn't have one. At a time when we're borrowing 40 cents out of every dollar that Washington spends, we should not have been there this morning considering new appointments to a commission that's out of work. We should have been there considering recommending to this body that the commission cease to exist. And here is why. It was created by the Help America Vote Act in 2002. It was authorized for 3 years and given certain tasks. The primary task was to distribute federal payments to the state to help them upgrade their voting systems. $3.2 billion was appropriated for these payments. It's been distributed. Given our current financial situation, it's very unlikely that any more federal payments will be forthcoming. We don't have any more money for that purpose. And President Obama seems to agree with this, since in his last 2 budgets, he's requested no funds for this purpose. Now, the Commission was also directed to develop voluntary voting system guidelines and a testing and certification program for voting machines. The actual work involved in this process is performed by another agency, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which develops the guidelines, and the independent laboratories that conduct that testing. So in the spirit of Senator Coburn's comments, we don't need 2 agencies assigned the same responsibility. Finally, the Commission was to act as a clearinghouse to collect and distribute information on best practices in election administration. Yet the intended beneficiaries of this service don't seem to have much use for it. The National Association of Secretaries of State, every state has one, a bipartisan organization made up of our county's chief state elections officers, has twice voted in favor of a resolution calling for abolition of the election of this agency, the Election Assistance Commissions. So we have a classic example of, I'm the government, I'm here to give you help that you don't want. Now, as a former state official myself, I was governor of Tennessee, I have a little bit of bias here. But I don't see the need for a federal clearinghouse of best practices for secretaries of states. I don't know why the secretaries of state themselves can't do that. When I was a governor, I didn't need a federal agency telling me the best practices of the governor of Oklahoma so I could use them in Tennessee. We had regular governors' conferences. We got to know each other pretty well. If Governor Graham of Florida had a good idea about education, I borrowed it. If I had a good idea, Governor Clinton borrowed it. That worked very well. We didn't have to fly to Washington to have a clearinghouse. So the tasks of this commission have now either been completed or can be performed by more appropriate entities. This is in the spirit of Senator Coburn's amendment. The commission did its job. We should thank the commission and the staff for their service. But if the completion of their appointed task isn't enough of a reason to close it down, the commission also appears to have a serious management problem or two. Though its mission has dwindled, its staff has grown. It has less to do, but has more people doing it. The commission had a staff of 20 in 2004. Last year it had 3 times that many. It had 64 people. More staff needed for less work. And I'm sure there's some very good people there. There must be, because the average salary, according to Congressman Greg Harper of the House of Representatives, for all the members of the Election Assistance Commission is over $100,000 a year. This year's budget submission from the Commission proposes spending $5.4 million to manage $3.4 million worth of programs. Does that make any sense? When the cost of overhead and staff salaries exceed the programs they have to administer, clearly something is wrong. And that's precisely the kind of small thing in the big picture that we deal here that adds up and up and up and up and creates an environment in which we seem to be content in spending more and more and borrowing 40 cents of every dollar we spend. Finally, the Commission has an unfortunate history of hiring discrimination. The Office of Special Counsel found that they engaged in illegal discrimination when, during the search for a general counsel, an employment offer was made and then withdrawn when the Democratic commissioners discovered that the applicant was a Republican. This resulted in a substantial financial settlement being awarded to the applicant, thereby forcing taxpayers to bear the cost of the illegal acts of the commissioners. And amazingly, it's been reported that in a subsequent interview with another applicant for the same position, One of these commissioners again tainted the hiring process by asking the applicant what the Department of Labor has termed, quote, inappropriate questions about his military service, unquote. Apparently, this commissioner didn't want Republicans or members of the military working at the commission. The Department of Labor has reportedly found the applicant's claim of discrimination to be meritorious, in quotes, and if not resolved, this case may also be referred to the Special General Counsel Office. I said this morning that the 3 men and women who President Obama had nominated seem to have exceptional backgrounds, and they're not to blame for any of these incidents. What I also said was, since they seem to be exceptionally good nominees, maybe we ought to find a commission where there's something for them to do, instead of a commission that's finished its job and we're just perpetuating with employees, all of whom average $100,000 a year in salary, according to Congressman Hall. Even if we were to assume that these nominees before us could right the ship and correct the problems, the question remains, where would the ship sail and why would they make the trip? Do we need the commission? With its main job completed, couldn't any remaining duties be better performed somewhere else? Can a government program ever be terminated? Mr. President Ronald Reagan once said, as I said at the beginning of these remarks, a government bureau isn't the nearest thing to eternal life. It is the nearest thing to eternal life that we will ever see. Shouldn't we try to use this opportunity to prove that Ronald Reagan was, in that case, wrong? So I congratulate the senator from Oklahoma for his work on duplication. This isn't the first time. This is one of many times that he's spoken and acted on the subject, and I offer this example of the Election Assistance Commission as one small step we could take in the right direction by, in the appropriate way, canceling the commission instead of confirming 3 new nominees to it. I thank the
Mr. President.
Chair, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Oklahoma.
I just wanted to, I failed to mention the co-sponsors of this amendment, and they are Senator Udall of Colorado, Senator Collins, Senator McCaskill, Senator Burr, Senator Paul, Senator Brown of Massachusetts, and Senator McClain. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Florida.
I ask consent that the Toomey Amendment number 514 be considered as having been adopted before the manager's amendment to S679.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask consent that I be allowed to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection, the senator is recognized.
Mr. President, thank you. Mr. President, I want to give you a quote from a publication. Days after working at Guantanamo Naval Base prison in Cuba, a U.S. Navy veteran found himself behind bars where he could remain for a decade for alleged passport fraud. End of quote. Mr. President, I had to read that article from CNN's website. I had to read it twice. I couldn't believe it. But that's what it said. Former U.S. Army specialist, now Navy reservist, U.S. Petty Officer, Second Class, Elisha Dawkins, 26-year resident of Florida, was arrested in April, and he spent now more than 2 months behind bars in the Federal Detention Center in Miami. And a federal indictment says that the serviceman failed to acknowledge he had once applied for a passport when filling out a new application, something that the prosecutors call passport fraud, something his public defender calls an innocent oversight. And Petty Officer Second Class Dawkins now faces up to 10 years in prison if he's convicted. Now, do you remember John Dillinger? He was sentenced not to 10 years, but to 8.5 years. And that was on a conviction for assault and battery with the intent to rob and conspiracy to commit a felony. Well, Mr. President, we all recognize that falsifying information on a passport has grave implications for our national security. And we want our government to be vigilant and to crack down hard on those who would attempt to sneak in here and do us harm. Zero tolerance. Zero. But according to Petty Officer Dawkins' Guantanamo Naval Base work evaluations, his superiors praised his work ethic and performance. He was a military photographer who, because of what he was photographing, had to have a secret clearance. He, by the way, had that secret clearance when he was an Army photographer in Iraq. And when he went into the Naval Reserves, they threw, and this is according to the U.S. Navy, they gave reciprocity for the secret clearance for him to go into the Naval Reserves. And as the Miami Herald reports in today's edition, he took 7,500 photos during his service in Guantanamo the 7 months that he was there. This is after his 8 years in the Army, of which he was in Iraq. His evaluation right before this unexpected arrest by the U.S. Navy says that Dawkins, quote, always lived up to the core Navy values of honor, courage, and commitment. Honor and courage and commitment. And he had that secret clearance while he was at Guantanamo, and this morning's Miami Herald chronicles the sensitive photos that he took of detainees there at Guantanamo. And in one evaluation report that was obtained by CNN, a superior lauds Dawkins as a team player with a strong work ethic and a desire to learn, and recommends him for promotion. And it goes on to say, Dawkins is eager to tell the military story and to further the image and success of U.S. service members, and that was written by fellow Petty Officer First Class Sally Hendricks. So let's see, honor, courage, commitment, a team player. Mr. President, I have sought explanations. I've been on the phone. I've talked to government high-ups in person. I've talked to the highest levels in the U.S. Navy, the Army, Homeland Security. I've just been on the phone with the very high levels of the U.S. State Department. And I want to know, does the military stand by the evaluations that they made of this fella? Is Petty Officer Dawkins, is he suspected of other misdeeds? If so, they better get it out. How did they give him a secret clearance while he was named in an old deportation order? Was this case part of an ongoing State Department diplomatic service crackdown on passport fraud? Does the State Department have any additional information that they're not telling us? From time to time, they have intimated that there's something more, but they're not saying. Well, did the U.S. military believe him to be a citizen during all those years of service in the Army in Iraq and now in the Navy in Guantanamo? Well, this case raises a lot of questions, and we need to get to the bottom of it. And I have taken an interest in this case because when I read these stories on CNN, the Miami Herald, the New York Times, and now it's gone all over the country on Associated Press, there seems to be a disconnect in government agency coordination. One hand doesn't seem to know what the other hand's doing, and a Floridian with honorable service in 2 services of the United States military has been in jail being held on a $10,000, on a $100,000 bond. He would have to produce a $10,000 bail, which he obviously doesn't have, and he's been there for over 2 months. Now, Mr. President, I didn't call the U.S. Attorney's Office because I respect the independence of the prosecutorial rule. But let me just quote for you this morning's Miami Herald, Carol Rosenberg, the reporter. She disclosed that a federal judge has now said that the U.S. Attorney's Office has made a secret offer to resolve this passport prosecution. The judge revealed the offer of a pretrial diversion in a conference that set a July 12 trial date for Petty Officer Dawkins. The idea, according to the Herald, is to give someone facing charges an opportunity to avoid prosecution through a program such as doing community service or perhaps taking a civics class. And the judge was so taken back by hearing this secret offer that the judge said she was left speechless, and she was quoted in this morning's Herald story as saying it appeared to reflect a kinder, gentler approach to prosecution. So whether the petty officer is released from jail tomorrow or whenever it is, we'll have to see, are there further things? And if it has to do with his immigration status, according to his public defender, which we have talked to, he came to this country from the Bahamas with his mother when he was a kid. He still is not a citizen, but he has served this country for years and years. And so I want to conclude, Mr. President, by saying this. If the facts of this case are, as we have been told, in the scratching and scraping with some reluctance on the part of agencies to talk, if it is as it has been reported to us, wouldn't it be interesting if the DREAM Act were in fact law? Because the DREAM Act would have prevented something like this from happening in the first place. Because the DREAM Act says that if a kid had been brought here illegally as a child, but that child grows up and wants to go into the U.S. military, as Dawkins has for almost a decade already served, then that legislation would grant legal status through a green card to that undocumented young person who wanted to serve the country. So, Mr. President, we ought to pass the DREAM Act. Every day we have examples of children that came here through no fault of their own, but who are unjustifiedly having the law come down on their head. And so I want to close by reading a letter to the editor in the Herald from Sandra Wallace of Miami. And this is what she writes. Elisha Dawkins served 7 years in the military in both Iraq and Guantanamo, where he was awarded medals for his behavior, yet he's being held in federal lockup awaiting deportation. This man thought he was a U.S. citizen because his relatives told him he was when he came here as a young child. Our military was certainly glad to consider him a citizen. Mr. President, the DREAM Act would allow the U.S. government to consider as a citizen someone who, like Elisha Dawkins, was brought here as a child and who wanted to serve this country. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Sean Mills be given floor privileges through the rest of the day.
Without objection.
Mr. President, millions of Americans are hurting economically, yet so much of the debate here on the Senate floor seems to be Democrats and Republicans fighting with each other or rehashing old arguments. It seems almost as if there is a default strategy, either pound on the other party or recycle some of the stale positions that have been repeated again and again. Senator Coates and I believe that none of this really does anything to help the millions of Americans who are out of work and get the economy moving again. And the two of us have been coming to the floor of the Senate, and will continue to do so in the days ahead, to talk about what really works. What really works to get the American economy moving again. And an example would be tax reform. Tax reform like the sort of tax reform that was passed when Democrats and Ronald Reagan teamed up, and that tax reform effort helped to create 6.3 million new jobs in the 2 years after it was enacted. Now, no one can say that there's any one factor that alone creates millions of new jobs, but certainly it didn't hurt. Certainly it helped to set the economic climate. Democrats and Republicans coming together, and according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in the 2 years after that kind of bipartisan effort, the country created 6.3 million new jobs, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, it's not going to be possible, of course, to pass comprehensive tax reform between now and August 2nd. But Senator Coates and I have said that as part of these budget negotiations, as part of the effort to deal with the budget in a comprehensive way and to deal with the debt ceiling issue, it ought to be possible to lock in for consideration in the fall and in the remainder of this Congress the kind of bipartisan effort that we saw a quarter of a century ago that represents an idea that really works, an idea with a proven track record of working to boost the economy that has been bipartisan, where Democrats and Republicans, instead of spending their time pounding on each other, say, let's come together and eliminate some of these ridiculous special interest tax breaks, which are limiting our ability to grow and create family wage jobs. So Senator Coates and I are going to spend a few minutes this afternoon talking about the impact of real tax reform on jobs and economic growth. And I'd just like to start, beyond thanking my friend from Indiana, he's been a pleasure to work with, about his reaction to that kind of approach, where we focus on really what works, and especially between now and August 2nd in these budget negotiations, Democrats and Republicans have an opportunity to look at spending and look at growth to make sure that out of those negotiations by August 2nd, there's a way to lock in for the fall and the remainder of the Congress the effort to promote bipartisan tax reform and get our economy growing again. I'd be interested in my colleagues' reaction to that.
The senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I thank my friend from Oregon for helping arrange this colloquy. We have worked together to try to fashion a comprehensive tax reform package that we think makes a lot of sense. And just about every analyst or economist or budget expert that I have talked to and listened to or read their writings over the past several months has said, we are not going to successfully address our current debt deficit situation unless comprehensive tax reform is part of the package with which we do this. Senator Wyden and I have had the opportunity to sit down and talk about this. We obviously have been encouraging for several months that the Congress go forward and address this. We realize that such an effort cannot successfully take place before we reach the point in August or early August where we have to make a decision on raising the debt limit, and whatever package is brought before us relative to what kind of changes we can make in our financial structure to put us in a better fiscal situation. Nevertheless, knowing the importance of comprehensive tax reform to the success to creating success for ultimately what we want to achieve, we would like to encourage all those negotiating these packages and all those members and our colleagues to look carefully at the proposal to lock, as my colleague said, to lock in to whatever package is before us a commitment, a hard commitment, an enforceable commitment to take up comprehensive tax reform, not waiting until after the next election, but take it up this fall as one of the follow-ons to the package that we ultimately will have to address, debate, and vote on coming up here in the next several weeks. I couldn't agree with my friend more that doing so now can be a very important component of our going forward in addressing the serious fiscal situation which is facing our country and which is one of our biggest challenges.
Mr. President, I thank my friend, and we're going to talk through some of the specifics of why this is important as a way to boost the economy. And in beginning, what I'd like to just lay out is that as we have seen these discussions go forward over the last couple of months about boosting the economy, invariably the fight comes down to the question of whether you ought to spend more. You ought to spend more in order, particularly in a consumer-driven economy, to create jobs and put our folks back to work. What Senator Coates and I have described is an opportunity in a way that is deficit neutral. Deficit neutral, and as my friend from Indiana knows, this has been demonstrated by our analysis from the Joint Committee on Taxation. This is a deficit neutral strategy for putting our people back to work, because by eliminating some of these special interest tax breaks, and thousands of them have gotten into the tax code over the last, quarter century, we can take those foolish tax breaks off the revenue rolls and use those very same dollars to create what we call red, white, and blue jobs, to put people back to work in the manufacturing sector in Indiana. And of course, the President and I know how deep the hurt is in our home state. And I wanted to begin this by way of making sure that folks really saw last month's job report as a wake-up call that would indicate that current economic, policies aren't creating the jobs our citizens and our economy needs, and would specifically be willing to look at new approaches in the sense that they be genuinely, bipartisan, but proven in the sense that they have a track record. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts the national unemployment rate at 9.1% in May. As the distinguished President of the Senate knows, we have parts of rural Oregon with unemployment that probably, if you were to calculate the real rate of unemployment, is over 20%. So the economic hurt is enormous. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics found that almost 14 million Americans who want to work but can't find jobs, almost half of them have been out of work for 27 weeks or more. Of the employed, 8.5 million have to settle for part-time jobs. And among the hardest hit are young people. The people who are trying to get in the workforce are anxious to show that they have good work habits and discipline but cannot find work. We lost 8.5 million jobs between the worst of the fiscal crisis and the end of 2010, and only a small portion of those jobs have been created. Moreover, many of the new jobs that have been created don't pay as much as the jobs that were lost. In particular, the loss of manufacturing, jobs, and so many of our citizens, when they can get alternative employment, end up with wages far less than what they made in manufacturing. In addition, income inequality is growing because high school graduates have a jobless rate twice that of college graduates. So with millions of Americans struggling to find jobs, Senator Coates and I would like to spend just a few minutes to talk about how we can come together and talk about ways to grow the economy. I've mentioned that there's a proven track record in terms of tax reform helping. 1986, the historic tax reform between Democrats, populist Democrats like former Congressman Dick Gephardt and the late President Reagan, 6.3 million new non-farm jobs in the 2 years after that law was passed. And I believe it can happen again. The Manufacturers Alliance forecast that Senator Coates and I, with our legislation, might have the opportunity to create nearly 2 million new jobs. The Heritage Foundation came in with the same sort of analysis. So you can never lose sight of the need to create jobs in an economy like this. And I'd like to bring my colleague into the discussion at this point, because he has done so much work, not just in Indiana, where they have, to their credit, focused on a manufacturing strategy for our country, but as part of this bipartisan effort, and get his sense of why the approach we're advocating today could be an economic boost for our country.
Well, Mr. President, I can't help but agree with my friend. It's a sad situation that we have in this country as our economy is just kind of limping along, that so many young people graduating from school just recently are unable to find a meaningful job and work, that so many middle-aged Americans trying to raise a family, save money for sending their children to school, are out of work, cannot find employment, not only at the level that they were previously used to, but even at a lower level. It is a situation that requires our enacting policies that will do everything we can to stimulate this economy and get America back to work. As I said earlier, comprehensive tax reform has been described as just with about everyone who's looked at this situation as an essential component of the kinds of reforms necessary to get us back to fiscal health. As Senator from Oregon said, one of the components of the tax reform plan, the Wyden-Coates plan, is that we want to maintain revenue neutrality, but at the same time we want to go after those tax exclusions and exemptions and subsidies that favor a few but don't have broad application. They've been added over the years, particularly since 1986 when we had our last comprehensive tax reform. Over these 25 years, a number of special breaks, special subsidies, special exemptions have been added, and it totals up hundreds of millions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars. And so what we're trying to do here is look at those in a comprehensive way, reduce or eliminate many of them, and then use the money saved from that to lower tax rates. Let's just look at the corporate rate. The United States, out of the 36 countries which we compete most directly with for sales around the world, The United States ranks 35th. We would be 36, except the Japanese deferred lowering their rate based on the tsunami and the after effects of that, because they had already had in place plans to lower their rate. So we literally are at the highest corporate rate of any major industrialized competitive country in the world. Senator Wyden and I, in our bill, agreed that we would take the money that was saved from eliminating a lot of those special breaks for special interests and lowering the corporate tax rate to make the United States more competitive, to bring that rate down to the mid-20s or perhaps even lower. And in doing so, it will stimulate our industries here, stimulate our exports, and put our companies in a much better position to expand and grow and compete across the world, and ultimately that translates itself into jobs. If we look at small businesses alone, the real job creators, we allow under our plan those almost all small businesses to expense their equipment and inventory costs in a single year. We also incorporate a provision of reciprocity so that those companies that do have overseas sales and entities producing and selling their products, that the earnings gained there can be brought back to the United States without being taxed on a double taxation, can be brought back over a one-year reciprocity period at a very low rate, again to encourage investment, plant equipment, and employment here in America. And so at a time when consumer consumption is very weak, consumers don't have money to spend, we believe comprehensive tax reform, and particularly some of the things outlined in our plan, will help stimulate the economy, will help bring about growth, and ultimately put people back to work. And so I would kick this ball back to my colleague, Senator Wyden from Oregon, for his further thoughts on that as we continue this colloquy.
Mr. President, I'm glad that Senator Coates made that last point especially, because it's getting hardly any discussion here in the Senate, and that's the point Senator Coates made with respect to the weak consumption that we are seeing in our country, particularly, middle-class folks who have the sense that there really isn't going to be economic security right now. They don't have as much money in their pockets as they would like. They've suffered, huge shocks that have caused them to pull back from some of the purchases they would otherwise make. The President of the Senate has done outstanding work with respect to trying to protect middle-class people who've lost all this equity in their homes. That usually serves as some kind of collateral for folks with a need to get a loan. That hasn't been there. We've had folks underemployed in much of the workforce. What we see is that in our economy, which has always been consumer-driven, as Senator Coates has pointed out, we're just not seeing the kind of demand from middle-class folks for goods and services. They're not going out and buying the refrigerator that they might like to have for their family. They can't get a computer for their child. They're just not able to make the purchases that are so important in a consumer-driven economy. And so what Senator Coates and I are saying is that as Democrats like Dick Gephardt and former President Ronald Reagan said a quarter century ago, they want to come together and put money into people's pockets. They want to make sure the middle-class folks who are just getting clobbered, as we have seen for months now, would be in a position to get back into the economy and start demanding some of those goods and services that are so important for long-term economic well-being. So Senator Coates and I have sought to put more money into people's pockets by repealing the alternative minimum tax. We had an excellent hearing in Chairman Baucus's committee yesterday on simplification. Get this. The middle-class, person is now essentially going through bureaucratic water torture on this alternative minimum tax. They have to fill out their taxes twice on two separate systems. So what Senator Coates and I have said is let's, repeal it. That'll put some money back into the pockets of middle-class folks. And as Senator Coates has pointed out, middle-class folks won't have to spend all that money paying out accountants and all kinds of other people trying to fill out all those alternative minimum tax forms. So we'll put some money into the pockets of the middle class that way. And Senator Coates and I also advocate nearly tripling the standard deduction for all our taxpayers, which again can be a real boon for the middle class, our consumer, that can help us spur consumer demand and with it job creation. So I'm very glad that Senator Coates has really zeroed in on the question of the consequences of underconsumption by consumers. And I think I'd next probably like to have my friend go through some of the benefits that we'd like to provide to small business, because we all know that small business is the creation, the job engine of our economy. And Senator Coates, if you could just outline some of the benefits that on a bipartisan basis we ought to be zeroing in on with respect to small business, I think that'd be very helpful.
Well, as the senator from Oregon has said, small business is hit particularly hard these days because many choose not to incorporate. There is a pass-through of taxation rates as if these small businesses were individuals. They're taxed at that rate. As my friend from Oregon knows, in the end of 2012, that tax rate is scheduled under current law to rise from 35% to 39.6%. Small businesses which currently are having trouble getting credit, currently having problems making ends meet, are faced with, within a relatively short period of time, a year and a half, of a tax increase. That is a deterrent to making decisions relative to expanding the business, relative to hiring new people, because they know that the taxes that they have to pay off of their earnings flow through directly to them and are going to have to be paid at the highest rate. And so, again, the Coates-Wyden bill prevents that from happening, keeps those rates at a current level. And also, as my friend from Oregon has said, simplification is a major underlying principle of the Wyden-Coates tax reform bill. It is a nightmare for individuals, as the senator from Oregon said, to try to figure out how to do this. In fact, about $6 billion is spent each year by individuals to hire professionals to fill out their tax forms, because it's virtually impossible for them to figure out and work their way through this, as my friend said, the water torture, bureaucratic water torture of a process. And the thousands of hours, the hundreds and thousands and millions of hours spent filling out the your tax returns based on the complexity of the current tax code is a detriment to small businessmen who don't have the privilege of having an accountant in the back room or hiring somebody who's an expert in taxes that is like big businesses can do. They either have to go outside and hire it, or they have to spend a great deal of their own time when they ought to be on the floor selling their product or running their business, just complying with the tax code. So whether it's tax rates or whether it's simplification or whether it's incentives for small businesses who provide the bulk of the hiring in the United States, in fact, between 1995 and 2005, between 60 and 80% of all new jobs were those hired by small businesses. So we are conscious of that in this comprehensive tax reform bill which we have introduced, and we want to make sure that not only individuals but small business people can rest with assurance that on passage of this bill, they not only will have a much simpler, easier way of reporting their taxes and complying with the tax code, but they will not be facing with a tax increase that, as I said, under current law is due to expire at the end of 2012. I want to once again kick it back to my friend to kind of wrap this up. I do agree with him that together in 1986, Ronald Reagan and congressional Democrats, Senator Bill Bradley, Congressman Dick Gephardt, Congressman Jack Kemp, worked on a bipartisan basis to pass comprehensive tax reform. It did many good things and stimulated the economy and brought about a lot of new jobs. It's been 25 years since. That code has now become ever more complex, and I think we do need to go ahead, and as I said at the beginning of all this, fundamental tax reform is one of the best tools in the economic tool shed, and it's time we use it. We know it won't be easy, but we know it's been done before and it can be done again. And working together, I believe we can take on the special interests that benefit from the tax code and create a much more business-friendly tax system. I can conclude at that point. I'd like my colleague to wrap up. I thank him for his inspiration and leadership on this effort. He started this more than 2.5 years ago with Senator Gregg in a bipartisan way. Senator Gregg is retired at the end of the last Congress. I had the privilege of not only being a close friend of Senator Gregg's and an admirer of his understanding and depth of knowledge about financial issues, but inheriting all the hard work that he and Senator Wyden put together to bring this comprehensive tax bill to fruition. We've made some adjustments and debates and discussions between the two of us. We think it can be the primary vehicle for moving forward. Are we locked in stone? Are we open? No. Are we open to suggestions to make it better? Yes. But clearly, if there's an agreement between the two of us that's unbreakable, it's that this is an essential part of dealing with our current fiscal crisis. And without this, we will come up short. Just about everybody that's looked at this situation has come to this conclusion, and we're hoping that we can, in this next few weeks, get a commitment from our colleagues and all those engaged in the process of trying to put together the package that can put us back on the right fiscal track and get our fiscal situation in order, that they will incorporate into this plan, incorporate into what is brought before us, a commitment locked in to go forward with comprehensive tax reform, and we believe the Wyden-Coates plan is the place to start. I thank my colleague for his efforts, and I'll turn it back to him to conclude this colloquy.